Hi, I'm Alex Udris. Thanks for joining us for the third VFR Live or Boldmethod Live VFR topic. And tonight we're going to talk about climb performance and different kinds of climb. And we're going to get into some hardcore aerodynamics. So I hope everybody brought their graphing calculators and some paper and has thought about differential equations, because tonight is all about math. Actually, not as much math, it's going to be done in charts, so you really don't have to think much about numbers. But we're going to get into drag, we're going to get into thrust, and we're going to talk about why an airplane climbs. And all of the information that we're talking about tonight comes from this book right here, Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators. This is the copy that I bought back in college in 1999, and it's a book that I have consistently used throughout my flying career. In fact, if you're taking an interview with FedEx or Delta, many of their interview questions come out of this book. And the advantage for you these days is you don't have to buy it. If you take a look at ForeFlight, I've got it up right here. You can download it for free in ForeFlight. The cover looks a little bit different, Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators, but it won't cost you a cent. And it goes through absolutely everything that you see here. All of these charts and pages, these are basically what we're going to be talking about. It is a fairly dry book. I think that's the hardest part about it. It's not really that exciting. But if you're looking for a good reference on lift and drag and thrust and aerodynamics, that's the place you should go. You know, every pilot loves Top Gun, and so every pilot should love Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators. And had Maverick spent just a little more time in it, chances are Goose would still be alive today. So let's start by talking about the different types of climb. And we'll jump into a video right here. Many of you are probably already familiar with these. I've got three different kinds of climb, each one happening in the same amount of time. You can see over on the left here, we have our best angle of climb. You'll notice that it doesn't get you as high as the other two climbs, but it does get you the maximum angle. So VX, our best angle of climb, that's a climb that we're typically going to use when we're trying to avoid an obstacle, right? Everybody's pretty familiar with that if you're a pilot. VY, the best rate of climb, is this middle one. You'll notice that it gets you the highest in a given unit of time. Another advantage is it gets you much further along the ground than VX. If you're not trying to avoid an obstacle, it lets you move forward and it gets you the highest. But in many aircraft, high-performance aircraft, VY is still a little bit slow. So in a Turbo 182, in a 206, in a Bonanza or a Baron, or even an SR22 or SR22 Turbo, you know, the VY speed is still a little bit too slow for cooling. And if you maintain VY, especially on a hot summer day, eventually you're going to start overheating the engine. So then we have another speed, and we call that cruise climb. And you can see that on the iPad. It's significantly faster typically than VY. In the SR22, VY is about 103 knots, and the manufacturer's recommended cruise climb is 120. But the advantage to it is it gets you much further out along the ground, and it gets you almost as high as VY. So cruise climb in a high-performance airplane, that's a speed that you're going to use most of the time. In fact, for us, in our SR22 Turbo, the manufacturer recommends 120. We typically climb at 130 knots indicated, because that's going to give us essentially the same climb rate as VY, maybe a couple hundred feet per minute less, but it gives us significantly more, almost 30 knots more of cooling, and it keeps the CHTs really cool all the way through the climb. The other advantage to a cruise climb is it lets you move forward. Typically, on a cross country, you're trying to go somewhere, so cruise climbs, they're going to get you forward fast. But ultimately, cruise climbs aren't based off anything. It's just kind of a speed above VY that seems to give you good cooling and still lets you climb. VX and VY, those are the speeds that actually have some science behind them. So that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about today. And as we get into the aerodynamics, if you have any questions, jump into chat. We got Corey Komerick on chat tonight. He'll be able to answer any of your questions or forward them to us. And then Colin and I will be chiming in as we move along. So the first thing is, why does an airplane climb? And, you know, if you're not a pilot, the first thing you'll say is lift, right? The wings make the airplane climb. And as pilots, we know nothing could generally be further from the truth, that it isn't lift at all that makes an airplane climb. It is simply pure energy. Whether it's thrust or power, it is energy that makes an airplane climb. So we've got this video. It's from our CFI tools. They're on the website. You can get to them from the home page. And it's the The forces in a climb, it's a free tool you can use if you're a CFI or you just want to play around and see how things change. But what you can see here is we've got an airplane in straight and level flight. We've got lift opposing weight, and we've got thrust this way and drag coming out that way. The four forces are perfectly equal, so we're in steady flight. And now we're going to transition to a steady state climb. So as the aircraft starts climbing, the flight path starts to incline. So you can see now the flight path is coming this way. Lift tilts back because it's always perpendicular to the wings. Thrust tilts up and drag tilts back. The only force that's really not in line right now is weight. Weight always points straight down. So as the aircraft starts to climb, we have to break weight into two different components. And that's the trick. That shows you why we need thrust. Part of weight counters lift. Okay, so you can call that the lift component of weight. And as we climb, part of the weight pulls backward, countering thrust. The steeper the climb angle, you can see the more weight we shift from lift to thrust. That rearward component of weight grows larger. So to stay in a steady state climb, that's now been added to our drag. So we have to add the same amount of thrust or energy or power to the front of the airplane. And the interesting thing is when people say, well, the airplane should climb because of lift, weight doesn't change. It always remains the exact same. But when you break it into components and you have this rearward component here, that tells you that this is now smaller than it was in level flight. So when the aircraft starts climbing, when we transition to a climbing flight path, we start breaking the weight up into weight opposing lift and weight opposing thrust. And the steeper we climb, the less weight is opposing lift, the less lift the wings need to generate. So when you're in a steady state climb, you're not climbing because of lift. You actually have slightly less lift than you would typically have when you're in perfectly straight and level flight. Okay, so hopefully from that you can see that number one, when we're looking at climb and climb performance, it is pure energy. That is the only thing that makes an airplane climb. And I know you've probably done this before. You can typically have a steady state climb where you add thrust, we're converting dinosaurs into power or thrust, or you can zoom. You can take excess airspeed, haul back on the yoke or the stick, and the airplane starts a climb. That's not lift that's causing the airplane to climb. You're just converting forward energy. You're converting that kinetic energy into potential energy or altitude. And zooming is a fine climbing technique. You just can't do it forever. Eventually, you're going to bleed off so much of that kinetic energy that you end up stalling the aircraft. Okay, so we're going to start tonight by looking at thrust, the basic pure force of thrust, and the associated climb speed that you get with that, and that's Vx. So first of all, when we talk about thrust, thrust is just a pure force. It is pushing backwards. And so when you look at a propeller, it generates thrust. When you look at a jet engine, it generates thrust. Now, you might have heard that a propeller or a reciprocating engine or a propeller-driven engine generates essentially power, and that's true. Power is force over time. And if you think about an engine, a reciprocating engine, it doesn't actually push backwards. It just spins a shaft. The more fuel you give it, it does not push harder on that shaft. It just spins it faster. That's the key. A reciprocating engine is essentially spinning a shaft, and the more fuel you feed it, the faster that shaft spins. So that's power. It's based off of time. Then we convert that to thrust by throwing a propeller on the front of it. The propeller generates that rearward force. And this is important because when we look at Vx and we look at Vy, Vx is based off of thrust. It has nothing to do with time. It doesn't matter how fast you climb on the watch. It's just simply your distance over the ground. So it's pure force. As we start to look at Vy, now we're taking a look at how high we can get in a given unit of time. And now we need to start looking at power. We'll get into that in a second. But right now, we're going to start with thrust, and we're going to start with the basic thrust required and thrust available curves. So I'll pop that open. So ignore this box that's right here for a second. Let's start with these two curves. This one right here is your thrust required curve. Essentially, this is also your drag curve. Thrust required and aircraft drag are the exact same thing. And if we look, you can see we've got a minimum point right here. That's the least amount of drag. We call that lift drag max, or LD max. It's the point where the aircraft can generate the most lift compared to drag. And this is a speed. Oh, let me pause that again. I'll rewind that to the beginning. It's a speed for a certain weight, altitude, and configuration, but it really is a point on this drag curve. Now, this is comprised of two different types of drag. You've got parasite drag, and you've got induced drag. So if you're not familiar with those, we'll go through those really quickly. Induced drag is the byproduct of lift. Lift from angle of attack, from Bernoulli's principle. Essentially, you're subtracting energy from the air. That subtraction creates drag. And if you really look at it, it's wingtip vortices and downwash coming off the back of the wing. That starts to create drag and a rearward force. The larger your angle of attack and the more lift you generate, the more induced drag the aircraft generates. So as we get slower, as we slow the airplane down to maintain level flight, we have to increase angle of attack. By doing that, we increase the pressure differential across the wing, and that generates more and more induced drag. So as we go slower in an airplane towards stall speed, we're going to increase our induced drag. Parasite drag is just based off of the shape of the airplane, the skin friction coefficient of the airplane, the design and the angles of the airplane. That drag right there, that drag doesn't change with weight. It changes basically based off of how fast you're going. The faster you fly, the more drag, the more parasite drag that you're going to generate. So as we get to, or I should say, the faster you fly, the more parasite drag is going to be prevalent. So when you're flying slow, you have lots of induced drag. And when you're flying fast, you have lots of parasite drag. Okay, so let's go back to this chart. What that tells you is down here, as we slow down, you're getting more and more induced drag. And as we go in this direction, you're getting more and more, in this direction, you're getting more and more parasite drag. And right here, at this minimum point, induced drag equals parasite drag. At LD max, those two are equal. And you can really see that. You'll notice that there's lots more room over here on the parasite drag side of the equation than there is on the induced drag side of the equation. And that's because eventually we're limited by stall speed back here. And this, you're just limited by the design and the engine on the airplane. It's also important to keep in mind that you have drag. Your induced drag might be high here. It continues, it doesn't completely go away. It just gets smaller as you go faster. Your parasite drag could be really high here. But as you slow down, it doesn't completely go away. It just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And you end up essentially with this drag curve. Okay, this right here, this light blue curve, that is our thrust available. And you'll notice that it kind of curves its way down, but it generally decreases as we get faster. So that's a characteristic of reciprocating or propeller-driven engines. And it's true for turboprops, and it's true for your traditional reciprocating engine. The faster you go, the less thrust your engine will develop. And that's true for fixed speed or constant speed propellers. The faster you go, the less pure force that engine is allowed to exert. And so that's going to determine our climb performance in our VX location. So let's go back and take a look at that chart. What you can see, to figure out where we're going to get the greatest angle of climb, we need to find the most excess thrust. So basically, the biggest difference between this part of the curve and that part of the curve, where this line is the largest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start back at the beginning, and we're just going to move forward. We're going to increase speed along this chart. And then this guy right here, this box, will measure our excess thrust. The up arrow means that we're getting more and more excess thrust. When that changes to a down arrow, that'll tell us we're getting less and less excess thrust. So as we start to move forward, you can see that excess thrust is it's continuing to increase. And you'll notice that this top curve, it is going down. Okay, so we're losing thrust available, but the thrust required curve is decreasing at a faster rate. So we're actually ending up with more excess thrust as we continue to move forward here. And eventually, it reverses. At that point, right there, we have the very most excess thrust. And for this aircraft configuration, weight and altitude, this point, this speed right here, is Vx. If we move the aircraft faster, you'll notice that excess thrust just continues to decrease until we reach a speed where there is zero excess thrust, and at this point in time, we can't climb at all. So the other interesting thing about this is you'll notice LD max is faster than Vx. So in a piston, or I shouldn't say piston, in a propeller-driven airplane, your Vx, or best angle of climb speed, is slower than LD max. And LD max is pretty slow. It's generally right about your best glide speed, depending on configuration and some stuff. But if you think about that, in the Cirrus it's 92 knots. Our rotation speed is 77. So, and Vx is very close, 88. It's very, very close to our takeoff speed. And that's a big advantage for a propeller-driven airplane when it comes to short-field, obstacle-driven takeoffs. So if you think about STOL aircraft, most of them aren't pure jet-driven. They might be like Traco and a turboprop, but they still spin a propeller out in front of them. And that's even true for commercial, large short-field aircraft, like the old Dash 7 or the Dash 8s that can do really high-angle takeoffs. And that's because on a propeller-driven airplane, your best angle of climb is well behind, well slower than LD max, which means it's right about at takeoff speed. So when you rotate and take off, you're already almost at your best angle of climb speed. Makes an obstacle takeoff really easy. So on a jet, it's a little bit different. And actually, I'm going to jump back to this. And we're just going to look at it really, really quickly. So if you look back at the iPad, the jet doesn't have a curved thrust available line. A pure jet has essentially a flat thrust available line. And so its Vx is right at LD max. So the interesting thing about that is if you have the exact same airplane design, you just swap props for a jet, like the Dornier 328 did. You had the 328 turboprop, then they took the two props off and they put two jet engines on. Now you have the 328 jet, but essentially the exact same airplane. Changing just the engine, switching from prop to jet, means your best angle of climb speed gets much faster, all the way to LD max. And so for a jet airplane making an obstacle takeoff, you run into a little bit of trouble because you've got to accelerate well past your takeoff speed to get to your best angle of climb speed. And so if you're trying to avoid an obstacle, you might have to keep the aircraft on the ground until you're closer and start lifting off, or climb at a non-optimal rate. There's different techniques for different airplanes. But if you look at short field obstacle-driven takeoffs, most of those, that kind of operation, it excels in a prop because Vx is below LD max and very close to takeoff speed. Okay, from there, let's talk a little bit about how it changes. So I'm going to open up on the iPad Vx and how it changes with weight. Now, the interesting thing you'll notice is if you look at your POH, typically the POH just gives you a speed for maximum gross weight. Some aircraft will let you interpolate, some aircraft don't. And so a lot of this, I wouldn't call it theoretical, it's just not something we can always compute in the cockpit, and it doesn't change much, but it's interesting to understand what does happen. Okay, so when we look at the iPad, I've got a couple things drawn out here. First of all, you're going to see the gray line right here. That gray line is max gross. Okay, that's as heavy as you're going to get. The dark blue line we'll say is minimum, like the basic empty weight. And what you're going to notice is the thrust required curve, it decreases, makes sense. We don't need as much thrust when we're light, but it also shifts. And the biggest decrease is noticed in speeds that are slower than LD max. Okay, most of that change is here. And if you think about that, it makes sense. Behind LD max, slower than LD max, most of our drag is induced drag. Induced drag is generated by the byproduct of lift. In fact, if you double the lift, you square your induced drag. So if it goes up by 2, our induced drag goes up by 4. Double the lift, 4 times the induced drag. Well, of course, if we're adding in weight, we're increasing lift. And that means that we're going to increase the induced drag by the square of that increase in lift. So as we start to get behind LD max and pile in weight and generate more lift, that induced drag goes way up. Okay, now think of ahead of LD max when we're operating in a higher speed regime. That's mostly parasite drag. Parasite drag isn't driven by the angle of attack. And so as we increase weight, it really doesn't change parasite drag much at all. In fact, it doesn't change it at all. So when we go back to this graph, you'll notice that as we decrease weight, we end up losing a lot of induced drag. We only lose a little bit of drag over here, and that's because the parasite's drag's not changing, though there is still a small amount of induced drag at those speeds, and that is still decreasing. Or you could look at it as you add weight. Below LD max, your thrust required goes up a lot. The faster you go, the thrust required goes up a little bit. Okay, so let's just move this forward and see what happens. As we measure the excess thrust, you can see it's continuing to increase, 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 and boom, right there it starts decreasing. So that's our new VX point at a light weight. Now let's compare that to max gross. Boom. Oop. You'll notice that VX at max gross is faster than VX at a light weight. So a way to look at this is as you increase weight, your VX is going to speed up. And that's because everything that LD max point's getting faster, VX is getting faster as you pile on more pounds. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens as we climb in altitude. So I'll pull up thrust and changing altitudes, and we'll clear out the chart. First of all, you're going to notice something. These have shifted. Okay, so the gray line that you see right here is sea level. The dark blue line is 10,000 feet. And what you've noticed is they're basically, in fact, I can do a better job of that. They sit on a perfectly flat line. Changing altitude doesn't change the minimum amount of drag for the airplane, but it does change the shape of the drag curves. Okay, so essentially, you can think about it this way. As we get higher, hold on, let me clear that out. As we get higher, everything ends up getting a little bit faster. The higher you go, you generate a little bit more, or you generate more induced drag, and that's because the air is thinner for a given true airspeed. Okay, so we're not talking about indicated airspeed, we're talking about true airspeed. The air is thinner, so we need a higher angle of attack to generate the lift. That generates more drag. But as we get faster than LD max, it's parasite drag. At a given true airspeed, the air is less dense. There's less air pressure against the airplane, so parasite drag starts to decrease. So the higher you get for a given true airspeed, you're going to need more, you're going to generate more induced drag below LD max. You're going to have less, essentially, parasite drag, which drops the drag curve faster than LD max. So let's go back in here and we'll just measure this as we go along, measuring the excess thrust. And that's where it starts to decrease. So you can see that our most excess thrust, or VX, is still behind LD max. And if we compare it 10,000 feet to sea level, you'll see that VX actually changes a lot. In true airspeed terms, as you climb, VX gets a lot faster. Okay, looks like we got a question.
Okay, I'm going to hop in with this. We got we'll start off with a VX question because that's what we're talking about here. And that is, on takeoff, why wouldn't you use VX all the time to get up to 1,000 feet pattern altitude in case you lose your engine and have to turn back? Is it better to get high in that short distance and stay close to the airport?
Okay, so that's a matter of preference. And we actually do the opposite. I keep the aircraft at a very low pitch attitude. So there's a hazard that comes along with climbing at VX, and that is that you're at a really steep pitch up angle. If you suffer an engine failure at low altitude with that really steep flight path and that nose pitched up. In the Cirrus, I think we're like 14 degrees pitch up. You have to get the nose forward very, very, very quickly to recover. And you're going to bleed off a lot of airspeed during that process. So if you're climbing at VX and you lose an engine, you need to correct very, very quickly to prevent the aircraft from stalling, and you can end up with a fairly aggressive descent rate as you come back down. So one of the issues I always tell people in obstacle takeoffs is you really want to make sure that engine is warmed up, run up, ready to go. And you're constantly waiting in case something goes wrong to immediately decrease that pitch attitude. So we actually do the opposite. When we're taking off, we keep the pitch attitude fairly low, because if the engine was to fail, we can make a smooth transition to best glide speed and find a place to land. And if you look at a lot of takeoff accidents, one of the issues, it's not that there's nowhere to land, it's that they end up stalling and spinning the aircraft into the ground. So in my mind, it's usually better to keep some airspeed, lower pitch attitude so you can transition to best glide and get yourself into a suitable landing area quickly. Next question.
Okay, next up, this one's from Mike, and that is, does the thrust available curve for fixed and constant speed propellers look the same?
It looks a little bit different, and that's because a constant speed propeller is able to be efficient over a broader range of speeds. So when you're looking at a constant and a fixed pitch propeller, I'm going to say this right, a fixed pitch propeller is going to have a faster drop-off away from its optimal speed. It's not going to generate as smooth as a decrease in thrust, but they all go down. So they all kind of have that you're losing thrust the faster you go problem. It's just that a fixed pitch propeller is going to have one, kind of good speed, and when you get away from that, that thrust loss is more aggressive. Okay, let's take a look. We talked about VX with altitude and how it increases. Let's talk about VY. That's the speed most of us use. The number of real obstacle takeoffs that I've done in a tricycle gear airplane or even a tailwheel airplane, in that fact, it's really, really small. And almost all of my takeoffs, especially in a training airplane, you're climbing out at VY. That's the speed that we use the most often. It's the best rate of climb. And because we're talking about rate, now we're looking at time, okay? The fastest we can climb, the highest altitude in a certain given period of time. And so now we have to switch from thrust required to power required. So let's just take a quick look at the basic thrust graph one more time, and I'm going to tell you how you end up with power from a thrust graph, because it's all drag. So we'll go back to the iPad. This is your thrust or drag curve, but it doesn't factor in time, but there's time right here. Velocity is time-based, right? Knots, nautical miles an hour. So the way you would convert thrust in pounds to horsepower is you take each point along this curve, you take its thrust and you multiply it by its velocity, T times V. Okay, that's going to give you a number that isn't horsepower. So to get the horsepower, you divide it by 325. That's a conversion rate. As opposed to thrust knots, you want to get horsepower. And so we do that for every one of these points along the thrust required curve, and you do it for every one of these points along the thrust available curve. That's it. That's how you transform thrust to power. It's thrust times the velocity point at that curve divided by 325. And when all of that is done, you end up with this curve right here. This is your power required, the bottom curve, versus power available, the top curve. And you'll actually notice that the faster you go, a propeller engine actually starts generating more and more power, right up about to the point where your power required equals your power available. That's the difference. You decrease thrust, so your VX is going to not be as good, but you do see that the faster you go, you can increase power. Okay, so finding the VY point is just simply looking for the most excess power. So we're going to measure the difference between the top light blue curve and the bottom dark blue curve. And we'll just move forward here, and we're passing through about where VX would be. You notice excess power is still increasing. We come through LD max, and excess power is still increasing. And now our power required is starting to increase, but excess power is still increasing because the power available curve is so steep here. We're moving forward, And right here, it switches to decreasing. That is our Vy point. And from there, any additional airspeed would result in a slower rate of climb. So our perfect rate of climb, our fastest rate of climb is right here. And if you compare that to LD max, still the lowest point, you'll notice that Vy is faster than LD max. Okay, so that's why the two speeds, Vx and Vy, are so different. And if you know Vx for your airplane and you know Vy for your airplane, you can kind of estimate where LD max is. It's going to be somewhere between the two. And figuring out Vy is as simple as comparing those two curves. Okay, so let's take a look at how that changes with increasing weight. So I'll clear this graph out again. We'll load up Vy with changing weight. Okay, and I'm going to describe this quickly. You can see this light gray line, that's max gross, and the dark blue line, that's lightweight. So you could say maybe basic empty weight, okay? Changing weight does not change the power available. That's the exact same. You'll notice that the curve shifts, just like the thrust required curve shifts, okay? Most of the change happens behind LD max because adding weight increases lift, which means drag goes up by the square. So that's a big change. We're operating in the induced drag zone there. Up here in the parasite drag zone, not so much of a change. In fact, parasite drag's not changing. It's just that you got a little bit of induced drag, and that is still increasing. So that's why you notice the high speed section is about the same and the low speed section differs. And as we start to speed up from stall speed, you'll notice excess power keeps on increasing, increasing, and there's our Vy. And if we take that further and we look at the two, you'll notice that as we add weight, the airplane is heavier, Vy speeds up. So here's the key thing. This confuses people. Remember, all of these are true airspeed, not indicated airspeed. Indicated airspeed is what the airplane feels. But when we're charting our drag and our power and our thrust curves, we're talking about true airspeed, which is not what we read off the airspeed indicator. And that's really important because we'll look at that in a second. But you'll notice that the indicated change in Vy is not always the same as the true airspeed change in Vy. Okay, let's take a look at how it changes with altitude. Okay, so going back to the very beginning here, what you can see is this dark gray is sea level. Or sorry, yeah, the gray is sea level. The dark blue is climbing to 10,000 feet. And what's interesting about this is remember how in the thrust required curve, they're all on a horizontal line? In the power required curve, these shift on a tangent line. So the LD max point will always sit on this tangent line. The higher in altitude or density altitude we get, you'll notice the LD max curve just follows that line. The lower we get, it'll just descend along that line. Now you'll notice that it does kind of rock, let's see here, rock backwards just a little bit. See how at higher altitude it shifts back. And that's because down here, again, as we decrease air density for a true airspeed, we have to increase our angle of attack, which means more induced drag. And as we get faster, our parasite drag decreases because there's less air density. There's less force to the air. Okay, so again, NOT's true airspeed. As we move this forward, we'll measure excess power. There is our Vy point. And if we compare Vy at altitude, Vy at 10,000 feet versus Vy at sea level, Vy increases. The true airspeed gets faster. But it's not as much of a change as Vx. Vx is somewhere back here. It's still significantly slower, or the change is significantly larger. So let's take a look at that and compare the two. Okay, this is speed and true airspeed along the bottom, and this is altitude as we climb. And the light blue here is our best rate of climb. As we increase our altitude, Vy gets faster. Oh, I cheated there. Vy gets faster. Vx gets much faster. But that's true airspeed. And the key with true airspeed is, as you increase altitude, you're going to increase for a constant indicated airspeed, your true airspeed gets faster. That's how we think as pilots, right? We fly indicated airspeed. So we always kind of think of it as the higher I go, the more true airspeed I have. But if you think about it, true airspeed is your real speed. Indicated airspeed is just what we see. So you can kind of look at it backwards. As you go higher, your indicated airspeed gets slower. And that's because you have less and less air pressure the higher you go. So now we need to transform those lines, okay? Yes, Vx and Vy both get faster in terms of true airspeed, but now we have to start to factor in that indicated airspeed looks slower and slower and slower. It's indicating slower and slower, slower for a given true airspeed. So as we do this, let's play this forward, and you're going to see that line shifts back. So the faded color is the true airspeed line. This is what it looks like on your indicated airspeed indicator. Vy with altitude actually slows, and Vx with airspeed speeds up. That's what you're going to see when you look at your airspeed indicator. As you climb, Vy becomes slower and slower and slower at indicated airspeed. Vx becomes faster and faster and faster. Okay, we got a question.
Okay, Toby's got a good question here relating back to LD max. So he says, if power is 0, what's the relationship between minimum sink rate and your best glide distance?
Oh, that's a good question. I got a great chart for it, but I don't have it with me right here. Minimum sink rate and best glide distance are going to be two different things. And I'm going to have to, let me get back to you on that, because I think that's a good topic for best range and minimum sink. I've got a really good graph that can explain it, but I don't think I'm going to be able to get it perfectly right here. So I'll get back to you on that. Colin, is there another question?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to load up a few more questions, but I've got one while I'm doing that, and that's back to this chart that you were talking about. Why don't you tell us about what happens on this Vx and Vy chart as they come up and meet at the very top?
Oh, sure. So, okay. So let's take a look at that. This right here is your absolute ceiling. Okay? At that point where Vy and Vx meet, at that point you can climb no higher. Your climb rate is essentially 0. And if you were to look at your power required curve and your power available curve, they would look like that. Available would just touch it right there. If you look at your thrust required and your thrust available, they kind of look like that. They just touch. This is your absolute ceiling. Somewhere below here, at 100 feet per minute, is what they call your service ceiling. Okay? Somewhere in between here, if you're flying a multi-engine airplane at 50 feet per minute, is your single engine service ceiling. That's with one engine feathered and only one engine operating, 50 feet per minute. Effectively, it's the highest you can maneuver the airplane. And then at 500 feet per minute, that's your combat ceiling. But when Vx and Vy meet right here, that's the highest you can climb. Okay, looks like we got another question.
Okay, I'm going to hop in here. Here's a good question. Is it possible to figure out how Vx and Vy change on my airplane with altitude or weight change? I guess this is probably assuming that it's not charted in the AFM or the POH.
That's a good question. So Vx is going to be kind of hard to measure unless you've got a a GPS and you're trying to compute, you do some test runs in consistent headwinds. But VY is something that you actually can figure out pretty well because it is going to change with weight and it is going to change with altitude. And so what you can do is just level the airplane out, trim it out. If you got an autopilot, you can set the speed and or set it up in a steady state climb and hold the speed perfectly steady and then just slow it down a knot. Give the airplane time to react. See how it's changed. Speed it up a knot. Give the airplane time to react. So if you're at your published VY and you start slowing the airplane down, see what happens. If your climb rate increases, keep slowing it down. If your climb rate increases, keep slowing it down. Now keep in mind as you do that, initially, you're going to be converting a little bit of energy as your airspeed slows. You're going to be converting that kinetic energy into potential energy. So you need to let that kind of zooming effect go away. So slow down a knot, let the airplane stabilize, let the VSI stabilize, or speed up a knot, let the VSI stabilize. That's the best way to figure out best rate of climb. Looks like we got another question.
Okay, we're going to hop in with this. It has to do with climbing, a little bit off of what we've been talking about, but a good question. And that's from Vincent, and he says, is it possible to compute top of climb accurately using your aircraft performance table? If so, what's the best way to do that?
Actually, the top of climb calculations are pretty good. The position along the ground, I have a harder time with. And that's because when you think of top of climb, you're really looking at a couple things. Time, fuel, and distance to climb. And when we look at time to climb in our airplane, if it's an unrestricted climb, the book is pretty accurate. So what we need to do is, in most aircraft, you're going to start with you get a time from sea level to climb up to some altitude. So if you're climbing up to 10,000 feet, you'll look at the time, distance, and fuel to climb for 10,000 feet. And then you'll go to sea level and you'll say, okay, what altitude are we at? 3,000 feet. You look at the time, distance to climb to 3,000 feet. You track the values, subtract those values from your 10K values, and that's what you get. The fuel and time, pretty accurate. The distance, not so much. And that's because it's based off a no-win scenario, which we never really have. If you want, you can sit down, and I've done this in flight school, where you look at that climb speed and you figure out a ground speed and the number of minutes that you're climbing at that speed, and that'll get pretty accurate, but you can't just do it straight out of the book. The other thing that you can do, that I'm a huge fan of, and we'll switch over here to ForeFlight for a second. We use ForeFlight's planning. And if you're looking for accurate fuel planning, I've written spreadsheets back in the 90s and used Excel to do all this. It was great. You learn a lot about it, but it's not very practical. If you look at ForeFlight, and we'll just do BJC to KGFK, and you look at its planning, and we'll give it a bit of a route here. So we'll say we're going to go through this VOR, toadstool. It does a fantastic job of figuring out your fuel burn. You can see it here at the bottom, and your estimated time en route, and it takes all of that into effect. Now when we're flying cross country, we've got their Performance Pro subscription. It's something that we purchased actually right after they released it. We were curious about how accurate it would be. Now keep in mind, typically when we fly IFR, we have to level out a few times. ATC does not give us an unrestricted climb. But we typically land with maybe a gallon or 2 gallons off of our planned, as long as there are no delays on the route. And considering that we're typically burning, 50 or 60 gallons on a trip, we'd usually like to land with 30 to 25 gallons in the tank. It's got 92-gallon capacity, and we burn about 16.4 in cruise. So when you look at all of that, ForeFlight's Performance Plus package really is very accurate for the SR22 Turbo, and I've heard it's really accurate for other GA aircraft as well. So that's something, if you're using the book, the time and the fuel burn is typically very accurate. The distance, not so much. What I would do is, if you're trying to compute that accurately, use your E6B, figure out, okay, based off a climb speed of 92 knots, true or whatever it is, how far you'll move, and compute it that way. Looks like we had another question.
Yeah, I'm just going to hop in here. Joe's got a really good question about engine cooling and cruise climb. And he says, his question is the cooling simply a result of an increase in speed and volume of air coming into the engine? And are there any other factors at play there?
Bingo. That's it. If you're trying to cool the engine, It's an air-cooled engine. The more air you move through that engine, the more it's going to cool down. And so that's one of the reasons why when we're trying to cool the engine, the first thing we do is look at an increase of airspeed. And going from 120, the manufacturer's recommended cruise climb, to 130, really, it doesn't change our climb rate very much. And so we typically in the summer always climb at 130. Now, you notice that VY slows down, and I know cruise climb is much faster, but it slows down on indicated airspeed the higher we get. If we start getting into the flight levels, if we're going above 17,000 feet and I'm at 130, I'm not going to climb anymore. So as I start getting around 16, 17,000 feet, I'll start slowing that airspeed down from 130 knots to 120 knots, and if you're at a published cruise climb and you see yourself leveling out, when you get high, you might want to slow it down a little bit. But the other advantage is when you're up high, OAT is much colder, and that typically helps keep your CHTs in line anyway. So that's the thing though, it's the faster airspeed, it's just pumping more air through the engine. That extra volume of air is cooling it down, and it's oftentimes much better than opening up cowl flaps or something like that, because you can move further across the ground, you don't have as much drag, you burn less fuel. Okay, that's all the time we've got for tonight. In 2 weeks, we do another one of these. So in the comments, please let us know what your ideas are, if you have any suggestions. And right after this, we're doing our IFR lesson on DME arcs. So we're going to take a look at flying DME arcs with HSIs and bearing pointers, and how to lead your turn onto the arc, how to compute lead radials, and figure out your turn off to the arc. Thanks, and good night.
One more thing I'm going to say, Alex, before we go. There's a link in the bottom to go to that live stream.
There is a link it's a different video link. So click the link in the bottom if you want to join us for IFR. Thanks.